Thanks. So hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm a research associate at the University of Cambridge, but I completed my PhD at the University of Bristol and still hold an honorary research position here. And today I'm going to talk about the multifaceted relationship between body weight and cancer. So it's been known for quite a long time that having overweight or obesity increases somebody's risk of developing cancer. And a landmark 2016 paper summarized all of this evidence and identified the 13 cancers shown on this slide as those which have sufficient evidence to be called obesity related. We've actually already seen this image once today in Nick's slide, but there's also increasing evidence that BMI doesn't capture the whole story. So this image shows two endocrinologists sat next to each other who both have exactly the same BMI. But when these two men underwent whole body scanning, they found that even though they have the same BMI, the man on the right actually had double the body fat of the man on the left. And as you can imagine, that has important consequences for downstream health. And as well as varying in terms of how much body fat we have, there are also differences between people in where they store that body fat. So this shows three MRI scans from three different women who all have very similar BMI. But as you can see, where they store that fat tissue is quite different. So in the first image, this individual tends to store their fat tissue quite viscerally, sort of around their organs, and we call this visceral adipose tissue, or VAT. Then the second individual stores it abdominally, but more underneath the skin, and we call this abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue, or ASAT. And then the third individual tends to store it more on the lower half of their body, and we call this gluteofemoral adipose tissue, or GFAT. And it's important to note that the fat tissue in these different body locations, it's not just the same cells and environment, but actually the fat in these different locations has different roles in terms of they produce different molecules like different hormones. And recent research has highlighted that for cardiovascular health, the relationship with obesity seems to be being driven primarily by this visceral adipose tissue, but it's not really known whether the same is true for obesity-related cancers. So there's an epidemiological method that's used a lot at the University of Bristol called Mendelian randomization, or MR. And I went back and forth on whether to include a slide on this or not. But I guess like part of the point of today is to get insights into what we're all doing. And this is like so widely used at the University of Bristol. And we had a question in the earlier session about how do epidemiologists know how one thing causes another thing. So basically, this method allows researchers to ask whether one thing causes another thing. So a lot of the statistical approaches that we use in epidemiology can tell us if two things are correlated with each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one thing is causing the other thing. So this method allows us to ask whether things are causally related, and it uses genetics to do this. Yeah, I won't go into it in any more detail than that, but if you hear somebody mention Mendelian randomization or MR, just think it's using people's genetics to ask whether one thing causes another thing. There are many, many caveats to the method that mean that we can't always absolutely trust the answers. But yeah, that's the kind of general idea. So what we wanted to do for this piece of research that I'm talking about today is, given we know that that obesity plays a role in the development of these specific cancer types, and that the fat tissue distribution across the body is important in cardiovascular research, we use this method, MR, to find out if the same is true for risks of obesity-related cancers. So many, many results from this research, and you'll be glad to hear I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I've picked a couple of kind of underlying messages that came out when we were doing this. So the first is that the fat tissue that's stored subcutaneously seem to be the most important when it comes to cancer risk. And so this is a little bit surprising because for cardiovascular health, it seems to be the visceral adipose tissue, but that doesn't seem to be the case for cancers. The second main result I wanted to highlight is that for some cancers, we basically see like null results across the board for these specific fat tissue locations. So for instance, for colorectal cancer, which is also known as bowel cancer, even though we see a clear effect for BMI and overall body fat, the actual specific locations of body fat we looked at, we didn't really see any evidence for an effect. And to contrast this with, for instance, liver cancer, we actually see stronger evidence and a larger magnitude of effect for these specific locations of fat tissue than we do for overall body size. So this suggests that for some, but not all cancers, where you store your fat tissue is just as, or maybe even more important than how much you have overall. So to summarize our results, we asked, does adiposity, that's fat tissue distribution, affect obesity-related cancer risk? And the short answer is yes, sometimes. So yeah, we found that we do see evidence for an effect of specific fat tissue locations on cancer risk, but this is by no means universal and really does seem to vary by cancer type. I haven't mentioned it in this presentation, but we also did some work to try and find the molecular mechanisms that were underpinning these results. But again, we didn't really see this kind of open up more questions than it answered, and we didn't really see any universal patterns there either. So these are a couple of remaining questions. So firstly, as I mentioned, trying to understand what's going on there biologically. And then secondly, whether there are particular stages of the life course where these fat tissue locations are more or less important. And the University of Bristol has several grants and research programs that are going to be looking at these relationships over the next few years. So it's really exciting that we might actually get the answer to these questions in that time. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the many co-authors that helped with this research and all of the participants and everyone involved in all of the studies that we use data from. And thanks to you for listening.